My next claim is that morality and purpose cannot be found within science.
In this video, we're looking at the second claim, that morality and even purpose cannot be found within a scientific framework. If you're enjoying this series and want to see more videos like this, be sure to subscribe. But for now, let's get on to the first argument by Bryan.
I think it's interesting that you say that morality and purpose can't be found in science. Actually,
No, within science.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Purpose, I actually grant you, because purpose is subjective, right? Unless you want to boil it down to the purpose of life is just to procreate, right? Sure, whatever.
I like how matter-of-fact Bryan makes this claim, that morality and purpose are subjective and therefore science cannot evaluate them. However, it's missing some extremely important nuance and a misunderstanding of scientific methodology. It's not that science can't evaluate subjective things, it's that science can't evaluate prescriptive things. Science can only ever be descriptive. Something that's descriptive tells us what reality is like. It uses experimentation, observation, and measurement to come to certain conclusions about reality. But you can never derive a moral statement from facts or from observations. To do this would be engaging in the is-ought fallacy articulated by David Hume, that no amount of descriptive is statements can ever get you to a prescriptive ought statement. In other words, science is never going to tell you what you should do. For example, science is extremely useful in the development of certain cures for diseases, but science is never going to tell you if a certain treatment should be required. Now, I'm not saying that science can't help in deriving a conclusion, but that conclusion can never be an ought statement. Now, Jordan Peterson and Carl Jung both agree that to speak of morality, to speak of purpose, is to speak in some sense of divinity. Elsewhere in this video, Jordan Peterson says this:
The domain of religion is the domain of morality and purpose. Yeah.
This is because they both understand reality as being imbued with purpose, that purpose is a fundamental aspect of reality. But just like other things that we know for fact exist, purpose is not completely observable, only its effects. This even happens with certain physical things such as gravity. No one has ever isolated gravity in an experiment. Nobody can actually perceive gravity. You can only perceive the effects that it has on objects. Same thing for consciousness. We can't observe consciousness. No one has ever seen a thought under a microscope. But we know consciousness exists and is real because of the effects that it has on reality. I think the best way to understand purpose and morality is actually comparing it to gravity. We would never say that we ought to abide by the forces of gravity, or that we should believe that gravity exists. Gravity is simply a thing that exists. It's a fundamental aspect of reality. The same argument is being made by Jung and Peterson, that purpose and morality are fundamental forces intertwined within reality that influence our behavior. They're not something to believe in or something to follow. These are the very constraints that uphold reality. Jordan Peterson then makes a very specific claim about the relationship between morality, purpose, and scientific methodology.
So morality is intrinsic.
I think
So it precedes science.
that actually
right?
a better way to define it would be that social animals, which we are, right?
Yeah.
Require some level of morality because it's the only way that social groups can actually survive, right?
That's my point with
Sure.
regards to science. Thank you very much.
Is that
Precisely the point that you just made, that science has to exist within a moral framework that isn't in itself scientific.
As I mentioned previously, the scientific method can only ever be descriptive, it can never be prescriptive. And for that reason, it requires some framework to serve as its compass. For example, in certain societies, science can be purely utilized for destruction and war, for the development of bioweapons and atomic bombs. In other cultures, science can be used for the complete opposite, to cure diseases and bring about the least amount of suffering or relieve suffering. And the point Jordan Peterson is making is that scientific pursuits always require an ethical context in order to function. So let's move on to the next argument presented by Luke, where Jordan Peterson gets more into this moral landscape.
That science is actually structured, at least in part technically, to eliminate such considerations from its purview a priori.
Okay.
Right? That's why we define science as value-free. Mm-hmm. But that has to be wrong because scientists have to prioritize their attention towards something before they can even engage in observation.
Okay.
And that act of prioritization of attention is a value-predicated act.
But here Jordan Peterson gives us a little bit better rundown of what he means by morality and purpose. And of course, it's a very Jungian concept. First, he mentions that science is specifically constructed to eradicate moral considerations. Science, in a sense, and from its inception, has been an attempt at objectivity. But according to Jordan Peterson, just to perceive reality, you have to have some kind of underlying beliefs about reality. And so even to observe something which we think would be objective is in reality an illusion. We're bringing and manipulating reality before we ever even evaluate it. The second thing that Jordan Peterson mentions in this exchange that's extremely important is how we prioritize attention. Iain McGilchrist has done a lot of research in this area and has written books about this topic. One of the most important things he says is that our mode of perception fundamentally shapes the kinds of metaphors, models, and language that we use to describe it. For example, if I choose to evaluate the brain as a machine, I'm going to look at it as a mechanism of cause and effect relationships. I'm going to look for neural circuits and switches, and there's nothing wrong with applying that approach. The important thing to remember is that the metaphors and language that evolves around how we describe something alters how we perceive it. This is extremely important because it means that no matter what we're describing, whether it's the mind or God, we can never be purely objective. It will always be filtered through the way in which we frame it. To illustrate this point, here's an example of some degraded audio. You will hear what word that you decide to prioritize in your own mind. There's also this famous gorilla experiment where selective attention results in change blindness, where stimulus is completely missed due to where attention is directed. So to summarize, our values have an extremely important and profound effect on how we attend to the reality that we're trying to understand. And how we attend, or the attention that we give something, determines how we perceive that thing. And scientists and really our modern culture has developed to attend to reality in a certain way and see it in a certain light.
In the Bible, it talks a lot about slavery, right?
Yes.
Yes. So in that, it teaches you how to take care of a slave. Rather than saying slavery is wrong, I think
No,
it
it
should
says
say
that in the story of Moses.
It says slavery is incorrect. It says
Well,
it's immoral.
that's why Moses leads his people away from slavery.
But why does the Bible predicate and tell people exactly how to take care of a slave?
Now, the concept of slavery in the Bible in this context is being used by Luke to essentially say, look at this moral framework that emerged from a religious source. It's clearly incorrect or clearly at odds with our own cultural understanding of moral principles. I think this is actually a great question and one of the best questions posed to Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson, in my view, digresses from Jungian analytical thoughts and kind of gets pigeonholed into supporting Christianity in a very weak way. Jordan Peterson doubles down on Christianity in this moment, despite it clearly proposing an extremely terrible moral framework, at least at that time.
That the reason we evolved, so to speak, away from slavery was because the West was founded on Judeo-Christian morality and the presumption that every person was made in the image of God.
One of the foundational things in Jungian analytical thought and Freudian psychoanalysis is that in order to be a moral agent, you must have a conscious awareness. That morality and conscience originates from the distancing of unconscious, more intuitive forces or impulses and the conscious mind's ability to override those. And so a moral agent must be a conscious agent. A good example is a little baby. A baby isn't a moral agent in our mind, and rightfully so. Jung argues that God is in this exact same state, a pre-conscious state, in the Old Testament. And so God is not immoral, but God is amoral. And it's not until the New Testament that God becomes a moral agent through the incarnation of Christ. It's a very complicated concept of God. I think it highlights the differences between Jung and Jordan Peterson and the differences between Jung and traditional theological understandings of God. Unfortunately, diving into it is a little bit beyond the purview of this video, but I highly recommend the work Answer to Job if you want to learn more about it. And I will be publishing a video on it soon as I just start reading it, and so be sure to subscribe if you want to see that. One of the inherent features of the Bible being such a long text is that it can support certain things and oppose certain things, just like slavery. There are passages that clearly support and oppose the practice. And this is where I think this Jung quote is extremely relevant, that we read into things just as much as we read the things themselves. In other words, as we read something, we are projecting our own ideas onto it. It really ends up as a reflection of what is going on internally, rather than the objective words that the person is writing. So the main thing I want to emphasize is that within the biblical corpus, you have support and opposition for slavery. So it alludes to something else that is selecting from the text in order to make these moral judgments. And because moral intuitions are just that, they're intuitive, autonomous, unconscious impulses, it seems very likely to me that unconscious dynamics are responsible for the selection of moral principles, such as slavery being bad, rather than directly taking it from a biblical text or simply a cultural development, as Luke suggests.
I feel like this is just humans editing based on the cultural evolution of
What do you mean
morality.
by just?
Just?
Yeah, just humans.
Well, humans.
Editing.
Well,
Yeah.
based on culture and history, right? We get better.
Well, they
and-
did do it based on culture and history, but
Yes.
culture and history have their foundations too.
And this again relates to what I was just talking about. The processes that we utilize to select things are based in unconsciousness, not in consciousness. There's an extremely famous study that many people pull from to support the notion that we don't have free will, that there is unconscious neural activity before our conscious perception of making a choice. What this alludes to first and foremost is that unconscious dynamics, unconscious neural activity has an extremely important influence on our decision making. How this relates to culture and history is that we ultimately decide our cultural developments and we decide our historical understanding. For example, right now I live in New York City, and every time I go to Times Square, I'm inundated with thousands of different advertisements, whether it's people on the street trying to hand me things or giant billboards displaying ads. There's so much information in that environment that my conscious mind cannot possibly conceive of all of it and understand all of it. So an overwhelming majority of it is done unconsciously. And where my attention eventually gets directed has been first evaluated and selected by unconscious forces, unconscious dynamics. The exact same thing can be said about culture. What we decide to make our foundational cultural principles is not something that we're consciously directing. The same thing with history. What we decide to emphasize throughout history is not something we're consciously selecting. It's something that our attention has been directed to based on a whole host of forces outside of our awareness. So for Luke to reduce this very complicated development of morality to, oh, it's simply the evolution of culture, is no different than saying, oh, it's simply the evolution of consciousness, which is exactly what Jordan Peterson is saying. So to emphasize this even further, Jordan Peterson says this.
What do you mean
Patriarchy.
it was driven by humans? Humans drove slavery too.
Yes, exactly.
So there's no argument there. If slavery and anti-slavery were both driven by humans, what does your claim that they were driven by humans have to do with it?
So essentially Luke is saying that it's just humanity evolving culturally to kind of outgrow slavery. And Jordan Peterson says, if the slavery movement and the anti-slavery movement were both driven by humans, and these things can just simply be attributed to the normal human development culturally, then really Luke isn't saying anything. What distinguishes the development then? Jordan Peterson is trying to get at the psychological differences that made the eradication of slavery possible. And again, like I said, we'll get even deeper into this in the next video when this conversation comes up again. Jordan Peterson ends this conversation talking about conscience, which is something that we discussed in the previous video, so I highly recommend checking that out, as I won't be touching on it now. The next participant is Bryan, and he starts off with this question for Jordan Peterson.
So let me ask you this. So if there is a God and there is a moral code and it doesn't come at your benefit, are you going to follow it?
It depends on how you define your benefit.
Essentially, what Bryan is arguing from the beginning is that morality is hedonistic and fundamentally selfish. Jordan Peterson emphasizes that this argument completely hinges on the definition of the term benefit. How do you determine if something is beneficial to the individual who is behaving morally?
Let's define benefit. Like, if I did something for your sister, would that be to your benefit? Like, how are you defining your benefit? Do you mean one of your whims gratified now? Or do you mean you and everyone you love and know over some reasonable span of time?
I think a very good way of understanding the importance of how you define benefit is simply looking at some examples. Long ago, Socrates chose death over renouncing his own beliefs and values. So if we define benefit as preservation of your own life, then obviously Socrates' behavior here was not in any benefit to himself. But if we define benefit as having a long-term impact on Western civilization, then obviously this was extremely beneficial to Socrates. Another very easy example are individuals like martyrs or whistleblowers. Their lives are oftentimes threatened, their reputations are threatened, and they may suffer for no expectation of a reward, but out of alignment with inner values. Jordan Peterson kind of alludes to different definitions of benefit. Are you talking about beneficial for all humanity across time? Are you talking beneficial for me in this moment? correct. Again, I think this is really the kernel of the argument at this point, and it simply depends on your definition of beneficial. Now we get into a really confusing and kind of exposing exchange between Parker and Jordan Peterson.
So do you believe in the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good notion of God?
What do you mean by believe?
Do you think it to be true?
That's the circular definition. What do you mean
How
when
is
you
that
say
circular?
you believe?
How is that circular?
Because you added no content to the answer by substituting the word true and believe.
In this exchange, Jordan Peterson is just straight up wrong in how he defines the term circular definition or how he applies it in this situation. But he is correct that the statement that Parker makes is borderline meaningless. And I think unbeknownst to him, and maybe even unbeknownst to Jordan Peterson, Parker defines belief in such a way that completely eradicates the psychological element of it. Right? To say that belief is thinking that something is true eliminates the ability to distinguish between these two things, between belief as a psychological attitude or internal conviction. That's number one. And number two, truth as an objective metaphysical claim. The issue is that Parker automatically assumes in his definition that to believe in something is to make a metaphysical propositional claim. For example, you may think something is false, but then act as if it were true. And according to Jordan Peterson's own structure here, your behavior is more indicative of what you believe than what you say. Or you may believe something to be true, not based on its objectivity or whether or not it's factual, but how it makes you feel. This potential that we know is so pervasive is eliminated inherently in Parker's definition. So Jordan Peterson then proposes his own definition.
If you believe something, you stake your life on it.
What do you mean by that?
You live for it and you die for it. That's what I mean by that. It isn't something that you say. It isn't something that's associated with logical consistency. It's not declarative. It's not propositional. It's not a figment of your imagination. It's the presupposition of your attention and your action.
So basically his definition can be boiled down to what you believe is what you live for and what you would die for. And it is the fundamental presupposition of your attention. As I kind of alluded to before, Jordan Peterson is explicitly trying to emphasize that behavior is more indicative of belief than what you say you believe. Here's a really quick example. Someone may say family is the most important thing to me, but they work 80 hours a week and they never attend family events. They're never there for their children or their spouse. Jordan Peterson would say that they don't actually believe that family is most important. They believe that prestige or achievement is most important. In times of tension, pressure, and suffering, where expressed beliefs can oftentimes conflict with your behavior, are extremely good opportunities to see what it really is that grounds somebody's attention. And ironically, this is what is about to happen with Jordan Peterson when Parker brings up this hypothetical. What follows is this weird back and forth between Jordan Peterson and Parker, and Jordan Peterson's underlying resistance to actually answer the question.
Would you lie to like save your children, your mom, your dad?
I don't think lying would save them.
No, can there ever be a circumstance logically that lying could save someone?
Yeah, and if you're steeped in sin, you're likely to live in circumstances like that.
I'll give you an example. If you're like in like Nazi Germany, and it is the case that there's like Jewish people in your attic and you're trying
I
to
know
protect
the
them,
example.
would you lie to like the Nazis? If
I
they're
would have done
asking?
everything I bloody well could, so I wouldn't be in that situation
you
to
lie?
begin with.
Essentially, he refuses to say that he would lie to save people's lives. And Jordan Peterson obviously looks terrible in this exchange. Ironically, this gives us a very good opportunity to see Jordan Peterson's framework in motion. So eventually, Jordan Peterson admits this.
Can you imagine that I was in a situation where the best I could do as a consequence of my previous mistakes was to tell the least amount of lie I could manage. But that would likely indicate that I had made all sorts of catastrophic errors on my way there.
We can take Jordan Peterson's behavior in this exchange as being more indicative of his beliefs than simply what he says, which is his commitment to truth. But it's very clear when Jordan Peterson's moral orientation to truth or the lives of other people is pitted against each other, he chooses the lives of other people. Jordan Peterson really messed up at the beginning of this exchange by defining belief in way too of a black and white way. In reality, like a lot of what Jordan Peterson says, your belief system does inhabit a hierarchy, which is something that we'll get to in the next video. Next video, we'll be looking at this specific claim. Everyone worships something, including atheists, even though they might not know it. If you're enjoying this series and want to see more, be sure to subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. I will see you on the next video.